The summer of 1943. The Soviet-German front was frozen in tense anticipation. After the crushing defeat at Stalingrad, the German command sought revenge, concentrating a powerful fist at the base of the Kursk salient. Hitler placed all his hopes on Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht's last attempt to seize strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. But the Soviet command foresaw this blow and prepared its response. On the northern face of the Kursk salient, Oriol acquired special significance. A powerful communications hub, transformed by the Germans over almost 2 years of occupation into an impregnable fortress. The city became the cornerstone of the so-called Oriol salient, a bridgehead from which the enemy threatened Moscow. On the Soviet side, the operation was prepared by the commanders of the Bryansk, Western, and Central Fronts, Generals Popov, Sokolovsky, and Rokossovsky. They were opposed by experienced German military leaders, Field Marshal Kluge and the commander of the Ninth Army, Colonel General Model. Both sides understood the outcome of the battle for Oriol could predetermine the further course of the war. By the summer of 1943, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front began to shift to the Red Army. After the triumph at Stalingrad and the successful winter offensive of Soviet troops, the Supreme High Command began planning the summer campaign. The Stavka VGK perfectly understood. The German command would not reconcile itself to the loss of strategic initiative and would try to deliver a powerful blow in one of the directions. Intelligence indicated that the enemy would concentrate its main efforts in the Kursk salient, which had formed as a result of the Soviet winter offensive. It was here that the Germans planned to conduct Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht's last attempt to regain lost positions. The Soviet command decided not only to repel the enemy's blow, but also to prepare a powerful counteroffensive. Thus, the idea for Operation Kutuzov was born. Its main goal was the elimination of the Oriol salient, a dangerous bridgehead from which the enemy threatened Moscow. Oriol, transformed by the Germans into a powerful fortified area, was a key point of this salient. Operation Kutuzov was closely linked to the overall plan of the Battle of Kursk. The Soviet command foresaw that after the failure of Citadel, the Germans would be forced to transfer part of their forces from the southern face of the Kursk Arc to the north in order to hold Oriol. This was supposed to facilitate the conduct of another strategic operation, Rumyantsev, aimed at liberating Kharkov and Belgorod. Thus, Kutuzov became the most important element in the chain of successive blows, designed to finally turn the tide of the war. For the operation, forces from 3 fronts were involved. The Bryansk front under the command of General Popov, the Western front led by General Sokolovsky, and the left wing of General Rokossovsky's Central Front. Coordination of actions was carried out by representatives of the Stavka VGK, Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky. Preparation for the operation was carried out in conditions of strict secrecy. Front commanders received directives from the Stavka VGK as early as June 12, 1943, a month before the start of the counteroffensive. They detailed the plan of the operation, defined the directions of the main blows, and specific tasks. Special attention was paid to the coordination of actions of all 3 fronts. The offensive was planned to begin after the German troops had exhausted their offensive potential during Operation Citadel. The moment of transition to the counteroffensive was to be determined personally by the Supreme High Commander. The Oriol salient had become an impregnable fortress over nearly 2 years of German occupation. The Hitlerite command perfectly understood the strategic importance of this bridgehead and invested colossal resources in creating a multi-layered defense system. Oriol became the center of this defensive system, a true bastion covering the routes to Bryansk and further west. German engineering units created 6 defensive lines here, up to 40 kilometers deep. The forward edge of the defense consisted of continuous, full-profile trenches with a developed system of communication trenches. Every 1.5 to 2 kilometers, powerful strongholds saturated with firepower were located. Special attention was paid to anti-tank defense. Anti-tank ditches up to 3 meters deep and 8 meters wide encircled all key directions. Engineering barriers were supplemented by dense minefields. In some areas, the mine density reached 5,000 to 6,000 mines per kilometer of front. Throughout the entire depth of the defense, the Germans built hundreds of permanent firing points. Reinforced concrete pillboxes with embrasures for machine guns and anti-tank guns alternated with timber earth dugouts. Many settlements were transformed into powerful resistance nodes with circular defense. Bolkov, Mtsensk, and Orel itself were particularly heavily fortified. In cities, Wehrmacht engineering units adapted stone buildings for defense, creating true fortresses within the settlements. For the defense of the Orel salient, the German command allocated significant forces. Formations of the 2nd Panzer Army and the 9th Field Army of Army Group Center were concentrated here. In total, up to 20 infantry, 3 tank, and 2 motorized divisions participated in the defense. The total strength of the grouping reached 330,000 men, armed with about 600 tanks and assault guns, and 7,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Air cover was provided by the 6th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, numbering about 1,000 aircraft. The Germans placed particular reliance on elite formations, the SS Panzer divisions, Großdeutschland, and Totenkopf, which were intended to serve as mobile reserves for counterattacks. These units were equipped with the latest Tiger and Panther tanks, capable of matching Soviet T-34s and KV-1s. The German defense system relied on favorable natural boundaries. The Oka and Zusha rivers, with their marshy floodplains, created natural obstacles for advancing troops. The hilly terrain, with numerous ravines and forests, allowed for the organization of an effective fire system and concealed maneuvering of reserves. By July 1943, for the Kutuzov operation, the Soviet command had concentrated impressive forces. General Popov's Bryansk front included 3 combined arms armies, a tank corps, and a cavalry corps, totaling over 400,000 men. The Western Front, under Sokolovsky's command, fielded the 57th, 11th Guards Armies and the 1st Tank Army, with a total strength of about 300,000 fighters. Rokossovsky's Central Front committed the forces of the 13th and 70th Armies to the operation, numbering approximately 150,000 personnel. In total, the Soviet grouping comprised over 800,000 soldiers and officers, about 20,000 guns and mortars, 2,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 3,000 aircraft. This provided a significant superiority over the enemy. 2.5 times in manpower, 3 times in artillery, 4 times in tanks, and 3 times in aviation. Soviet tank formations looked particularly impressive. The 1st and 5th Tank Corps were equipped with the newest T-34-76s, featuring enhanced armor and improved optics. Heavy KV-1S tanks and the first examples of the IS-1 were intended to be the answer to German Tigers. New self-propelled guns, Su-122 and Su-152, nicknamed Beast Hunters by soldiers, were designed to combat heavy enemy armored vehicles. The technical equipment of Soviet troops significantly improved. Artillery received new models of anti-tank guns, the ZIS-2 and ZIS-3, capable of penetrating the armor of any German tank. BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers and the newest BM-3112 provided powerful fire support. Soviet aviation introduced improved IL-2 attack aircraft with a rear gunner's position. LA-5FN, and Yak-9 fighters, which were not inferior to the best Luftwaffe models. The morale of Soviet troops was high. The victory at Stalingrad, the successful winter offensive, and confidence in their own strength created a favorable psychological background. Many formations had rich combat experience. At the same time, German troops, despite their high discipline and technical equipment, were beginning to experience fatigue from the protracted war. The failure of Operation Citadel undermined the belief of many Wehrmacht soldiers in the possibility of victory on the Eastern Front. A significant advantage for the Soviet side was the increased level of combat training. Commanders at all levels gained the necessary experience in planning and conducting offensive operations. Staffs learned to clearly coordinate the actions of various branches of service. Soldiers mastered the tactics of assaulting fortified positions and conducting urban combat, skills that would soon be needed during the liberation of Oriol. The success of any military operation largely depends on the quality of intelligence and the thoroughness of planning. Operation Kutuzov was no exception. In June-July 1943, Soviet command launched extensive reconnaissance activities in the Orel direction. Aerial reconnaissance daily conducted flights over enemy positions, recording changes in the defense system, troop movements, and the location of firing points. Reconnaissance pilots in PE-2 aircraft and modified fighters returned with invaluable photographs, allowing staffs to analyze the enemy's fortification system in minute detail. Troop reconnaissance played a special role. Reconnaissance groups regularly penetrated enemy rear, captured tongues, prisoners of war for interrogation, and obtained documents. In the first 10 days of July alone, more than 30 reconnaissance missions were carried out, providing the command with precise data on the location of strongholds, minefields, and anti-tank barriers. Reconnaissance determined that the most vulnerable areas in the German defense were the junctions between formations and the flanks of the main groupings. An invaluable contribution to the preparation of the operation was made by the partisans of the Orel region. More than 100 partisan detachments, with a total strength of about 60,000 fighters, operated in the enemy's rear. Partisan formations under the command of Emliutin and Duka controlled significant territories, transformed into veritable partisan regions. They not only gathered intelligence, but also struck enemy communications. On the eve of the offensive, partisans received orders to intensify sabotage activities on railways. In the first 10 days of July alone, more than 40 enemy echelons with manpower, equipment, and ammunition were derailed. Based on the intelligence gathered, the front staffs developed a detailed plan for the offensive operation. The main blow was delivered by the forces of the Bryansk and Western fronts, in converging directions from the north and east. The Central Front was to deliver an auxiliary blow from the south. This scheme allowed for the encirclement of the Orel salient from 3 sides and created a threat of encirclement of the main enemy forces. To break through the powerful defense, special strike groups were created. They included rifle divisions, reinforced with tank and artillery units. In the directions of the main attacks, the artillery density reached 200 to 250 barrels per kilometer of front. Tank corps were consolidated into powerful mobile groups, ready to develop success after breaking through the defense. Special attention was paid to artillery support. A plan for fire suppression was developed, providing for the sequential suppression of enemy defenses to a depth of up to 8 kilometers. To combat long-term firing points, special artillery destruction groups were created, armed with powerful guns of 152 and 203 mm caliber. July 12, 1943, 3:20 a.m. The pre-dawn silence over the Orel salient was shattered by the roar of artillery cannonade. More than 5,000 guns and mortars of the Bryansk and Western fronts simultaneously opened fire on enemy positions. Operation Kutuzov had begun. The artillery preparation lasted 2.5 hours. Soviet artillerymen methodically suppressed firing points, destroyed dugouts and command posts, and cleared passages in minefields. Heavy howitzers and BM-13 rocket launchers played a special role. Their salvos literally plowed the forward edge of the German defense. At 5:40 a.m., hundreds of green rockets soared into the sky, a signal to attack. Infantry and tanks moved forward. In the direction of the main thrust of the Bryansk front, units of the 11th Guards Army under General Bagramian advanced. Overcoming fierce enemy resistance, they by noon had wedged into the German defense to a depth of up to 8 kilometers. The Western Front also achieved significant success. Troops of the 57th Army broke through the first line of defense and advanced 5 to 6 kilometers. The German command was caught off guard. Field Marshal Klug urgently requested permission from Hitler to transfer additional forces from the southern flank of the Kursk Bulge. However, the Führer, still hoping for the success of Operation Citadel, refused this request. The Germans had to use only available reserves. By the end of the day, units of the Grossdeutschland Panzer Division were thrown into battle. Fierce tank battles ensued. Soviet tank crews of the 1st Tank Corps under General Butkov met the counterattack fully prepared. T-34s maneuvered on the battlefield, flanking heavy German vehicles. Lieutenant Dreigen's crew particularly distinguished itself, knocking out 3 Tigers in one battle. By the evening of the first day of the offensive, it became clear that the first line of German defense had been broken through in all directions. Soviet troops captured more than 20 strongholds, took over 800 enemy soldiers and officers prisoner. Dozens of guns and mortars, ammunition and food depots were captured. Despite fierce enemy resistance, the plan for the first day of the operation was fulfilled. On the evening of July 12th, the front commanders reported the results achieved to the Stavka. Stalin was pleased with the start of the operation and ordered the offensive to continue, not allowing the enemy to regroup forces and organize a stable defense. Special attention was paid to the interaction of ground forces and aviation. The air armies of the fronts made more than 1,000 sorties that day, providing cover for advancing units and striking enemy reserves. The first day of Operation Kutuzov showed the increased skill of Soviet commanders and soldiers. The offensive developed according to plan, and now it was necessary to consolidate the achieved success. Armored forces played a decisive role in Operation Kutuzov. After breaking through the first line of defense, the main forces of the 1st and 5th Tank Corps were committed to battle. Soviet command bet on the massive use of armored vehicles, capable of developing tactical success into an operational breakthrough. General Butkov's 1st Tank Corps advanced in the Bryansk front sector, while General Sakhno's 5th Tank Corps operated in the direction of the Western Front's main strike. Both of these powerful armored groupings numbered over 500 tanks and self-propelled guns. The core of the tank formations consisted of medium T-34 tanks, supplemented by heavy KV-1 tanks and Su-122 self-propelled guns. German anti-tank defenses posed a serious obstacle. The enemy created an echelon system of anti-tank strongpoints, each of which had up to 10 to 12 guns. The newest 75mm POC-40 anti-tank guns, capable of hitting Soviet tanks at a distance of over a kilometer, posed a particular danger. To combat tank wedges, the Germans also actively used Sturmgeschütz assault guns and heavy Tiger tanks. In some areas, tank destroyer units, armed with Faustpatronen and anti-tank mines, were concentrated. Soviet tankers developed effective tactics for overcoming anti-tank defenses. The offensive was conducted not in a continuous line, but in battle groups, each of which included medium and heavy tanks, self-propelled guns, and motorized infantry. Heavy KV-1 tanks moved ahead, taking on the main fire of anti-tank weapons. Their powerful armor withstood hits from most German shells. T-34 tanks followed, maneuvering on the battlefield and destroying identified firing points. Su-122 self-propelled guns supported the tanks with fire from their powerful howitzers, destroying pillboxes and bunkers. Motorized infantry and armored personnel carriers and trucks completed the rout of the enemy in strongpoints. The use of tank-borne assault forces proved particularly effective. Groups of submachine gunners positioned on the armor of tanks covered the vehicles from enemy tank destroyers and dismounted at the right moment to destroy anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. This interaction of tanks and infantry allowed for successful overcoming of even the most fortified positions. When encountering German heavy tanks, Soviet crews used the carousel tactic. Several T-34 tanks attacked a Tiger from different directions, preventing it from concentrating fire on a single target. Taking advantage of their speed and maneuverability, Soviet tankers moved to the flanks and rear of the heavy German vehicles, hitting them in vulnerable spots. On July 15th, one of the largest tank battles of the operation occurred in the area of the settlement of Bulkov. Here, the 5th Tank Corps encountered a counterattack by 2 enemy tank divisions, numbering over 150 tanks and assault guns. In a fierce battle that lasted all day, Soviet tankers not only repelled the counterattack, but also inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, destroying over 60 units of armored vehicles. By the end of July 18th, the Red Army's tank formations, having overcome all lines of defense, reached the near approaches to Orel. Their rapid advance created a threat of encirclement for the main forces of the German grouping and forced the enemy to begin withdrawing troops from the Orel salient. The sky over Orel became an arena for fierce confrontation between Soviet and German aviation. With the start of Operation Kutuzov, the air armies of the Bryansk, Western, and Central fronts launched a large-scale offensive in the air. More than 3,000 Soviet aircraft opposed approximately 1,000 Luftwaffe machines. Such superiority allowed the Soviet command to seize air superiority from the first hours of the operation. The main strike force consisted of IL-2 attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Germans. These armored machines delivered devastating blows to the forward edge of the defense, destroying firing points, artillery positions, and concentrations of equipment. Group attacks by attack aircraft were particularly effective, with 8 to 12 machines simultaneously attacking a narrow section of the defense. Modernized IL-2s with rear gun mounts became a real nightmare for German fighters attempting to attack them from behind. Bomber aviation primarily targeted rear area objects. PE-2s and Tu-2s struck railway junctions, bridges, and concentrations of enemy reserves. Special attention was paid to Luftwaffe airfields. Massive raids by Soviet bombers forced the German command to withdraw some aircraft to reserve airfields, which reduced the intensity of air support for German troops. Fighter aviation had 2 main tasks: covering advancing troops and escorting bombers and attack aircraft. La-5s and Yak-9s engaged in intense aerial battles with German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The superiority of Soviet pilots in numbers and their growing skill allowed them to prevail in most aerial engagements. In the first 3 days of the operation alone, over 150 German aircraft were shot down. Aerial reconnaissance played a special role. Light and maneuverable U-2s performed dozens of sorties daily, recording enemy troop movements. Specialized PE-2 and Yak-9 reconnaissance aircraft with photographic equipment delivered invaluable information about the defense system and the location of reserves to the command. Thanks to this data, artillery could deliver precise strikes against identified targets. Air observers and fire spotters, located at the front line, maintained constant communication with aviation. Based on their target designations, attack aircraft and bombers struck the most dangerous sections of the enemy's defense. Such interactions significantly increased the effectiveness of air support for ground troops. The German command attempted to counter the Soviet air offensive. Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, piloted by experienced aces, engaged in fierce battles with Soviet machines. However, the numerical superiority of Soviet aviation and the need to disperse forces to cover troops, airfields, and communications prevented the Luftwaffe from effectively countering the Red Army's air offensive. By mid-July, the superiority of Soviet aviation in the sky over the Oral salient became absolute. This allowed ground troops to advance under reliable air cover, without fear of airstrikes. German aviation was forced to operate mainly at dusk and at night, which significantly reduced its effectiveness. After breaking through the first line of defense, Soviet troops approached the main German defensive line. The second line was a true fortified area with concrete firing positions, an extensive system of trenches, and powerful anti-tank barriers. The German command expected to halt the Soviet offensive here. Red Army artillery played a decisive role in overcoming this line. Before the assault on the second line of defense, a large-scale artillery preparation was carried out. High-power guns, 152 and 203 mm howitzers, systematically destroyed reinforced concrete pillboxes. Special destruction groups were formed to combat the fortifications, each consisting of 2 or 3 heavy guns, supplied with an increased ammunition load of concrete-piercing shells. German pillboxes located on commanding heights posed a particular challenge. To suppress them, BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers were used, creating a high density of fire over a limited area. In some cases, heavy aerial bombs dropped by Il-2 attack aircraft from low altitudes were used to increase accuracy. In the 11th Guards Army's sector of the offensive, the Germans created a particularly strong resistance node near the village of Ulianovo. Here, 15 pillboxes and over 20 dugouts were located, covered by minefields and wire entanglements. The artillery bombardment could not completely suppress this defense, and Soviet troops had to storm the fortifications. In these battles, the mass heroism of Soviet soldiers was demonstrated. Sergeant Vasily Petrov, with his squad, using smoke grenades for cover, managed to clear passages through the minefield and approach the embrasure of a pillbox. With a grenade throw, he destroyed the machine gun crew, and then, breaking into the fortification, eliminated 3 more German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. This allowed the rifle company to advance and capture an important height. Private Ivan Sidorenko, acting as part of an assault group, crawled to a German pillbox and threw grenades into its embrasures. When he ran out of grenades, he covered the embrasure with his body, repeating the feat of Alexander Matrosov. At the cost of his life, he ensured the successful attack of his comrades. In the Bolkov area, the anti-tank gun crew of Senior Sergeant Mikhail Kuznetsov particularly distinguished themselves. Rolling their gun into direct fire, the artillerymen destroyed 3 machine gun nests and suppressed the fire of a German battery. When the enemy counterattacked with the support of assault guns, Kuznetsov's crew knocked out 2 self-propelled guns, continuing to fire even after the commander himself was wounded. Breaking through the second line of defense required close cooperation of all branches of service. Tanks supported the infantry, suppressing firing points. Engineering units cleared passages in minefields, and artillery fired at identified targets. Aviation struck enemy reserves, preventing the Germans from maneuvering their forces. By the evening of July 17th, the second line of defense had been breached in all directions. Soviet troops advanced 10 to 15 kilometers, threatening to encircle the entire Oryol enemy grouping. The German command was forced to begin withdrawing troops to avoid complete defeat. The German High Command desperately tried to halt the Soviet offensive, which unfolded with such rapidity. When it became clear that the first and second lines of defense had been breached, Field Marshal Kluge ordered all available reserves to be committed. Combat-ready units were urgently transferred from other sectors of the front. tank and motorized formations rushed to Orel by rail and highway. Particular hopes were placed on the elite SS Panzer divisions. The Grossdeutschland Panzer Division, equipped with the latest Tigers and Panthers, was redeployed to the Bulkov area to launch a counterattack on the flank of the advancing Soviet troops. The Totenkopf Division, hastily transferred from the southern face of the Kursk salient, concentrated west of Orel, preparing to cut off the communications of Soviet tank formations. On July 20, the Germans launched a powerful counterattack in the Kromy area. More than 100 tanks and assault guns, supported by aviation, attacked the positions of the 70th Army of the Central Front. A fierce battle ensued. Soviet artillerymen met the attacking tanks with organized fire. ZS-2 anti-tank guns, brought forward for direct fire, knocked out 17 German vehicles in the first minutes of the battle. The enemy, disregarding losses, continued the offensive. At a critical moment, Army Commander General Baksov committed his last reserve, an anti-tank brigade. Its crews, skillfully using the terrain's folds, opened flanking fire on the German tanks. This decided the outcome of the battle. Having lost another 23 vehicles, the Germans were forced to retreat. In other sectors of the front, a real tank duel unfolded. German Tigers, having an advantage in firing range, tried to destroy Soviet tanks from a distance of 1.5 to 2 kilometers. However, Soviet tank crews employed effective tactics. Using terrain folds and smokescreens, they closed in on heavy German tanks to effective firing range and struck them in the sides and rear, where the armor was thinner. A characteristic feature of this stage of the battle was the Germans' maneuver defense. Lacking sufficient forces to hold a continuous front, the enemy created mobile combat groups consisting of tanks, self-propelled guns, and motorized infantry. These groups launched short counterattacks against advancing Soviet units, and then quickly withdrew to new lines. However, such tactics proved largely ineffective against the massive Soviet offensive. The superiority in forces allowed the Soviet command to simultaneously develop an offensive in several directions, stretching German reserves. When the enemy concentrated forces for a counterattack in one sector, Soviet troops achieved success in another. By July 23, it became evident that the Germans were losing the battle for the Orel salient. Hitler, finally realizing the seriousness of the situation, authorized a systematic withdrawal of troops to avoid encirclement. However, it was already too late. Soviet tank wedges had deeply penetrated the enemy's defenses, creating a real threat of encirclement for the entire grouping. The Orel region became one of the centers of the partisan movement in the occupied territories. By the summer of 1943, over 100 partisan detachments, totaling more than 60,000 people, were active here. In fact, the partisans controlled significant territories, transformed into true partisan regions, where Soviet power was restored and new detachments of People's Avengers were formed. Preparations for Operation Kutuzov began long before its official start. As early as May, front commanders received directives from the Stavka regarding the coordination of actions with partisan formations. A unified headquarters was created, leading all partisan formations of the Orel region. It was headed by the experienced commander Alexander Emliutin, whose formation numbered over 15,000 fighters. The main task of the partisans was to disorganize the German rear and disrupt enemy communications. A devastating blow was dealt to the railway war. In the first 10 days of July alone, partisans blew up over 50 echelons with manpower, equipment, and ammunition. Particularly effective were the actions of the Chapayev detachment, under the command of Dmitry Medvedev, which destroyed 4 railway bridges on the Bryansk-Oryol line. Intelligence activities were no less important. Partisan scouts infiltrated enemy garrisons, obtaining valuable information about the defense system, the location of headquarters and warehouses. This information was immediately transmitted to the command of the advancing Soviet troops. Thanks to partisan intelligence data, Soviet aviation delivered precise strikes against concentrations of enemy troops and equipment. To coordinate the actions of partisans with regular Red Army units, special radio stations and liaison officers, delivered by U-2 aircraft to partisan areas, were used. This allowed for synchronizing partisan strikes with the advance of the fronts. When Soviet troops went on the offensive, partisan detachments intensified their actions, striking at retreating German units. The partisan brigade for the Motherland, under the command of Mikhail Duka, distinguished itself particularly. On the night of July 16th, his fighters captured and held a strategically important bridge over the Nuga River, preventing the Germans from blowing up the crossing. This ensured the rapid advance of units of the 11th Guards Army. For this feat, the brigade commander was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Partisans not only struck at communications, but also engaged in direct combat with the enemy. The Death to Fascism detachment, numbering about 700 people, attacked the German garrison in the city of Karachev, diverting significant enemy forces. This allowed Soviet troops to break through the defense on a neighboring sector of the front. During Operation Kutuzov, partisans captured and held several airfields in the enemy's rear. Ammunition and medical supplies were delivered to these sites for partisan detachments, and the wounded were evacuated on return flights. In addition, these airfields were used by Soviet aviation for refueling during deep raids into the enemy's rear. As Soviet troops advanced, many partisan detachments joined with regular Red Army units, acting as guides and providing valuable intelligence about the enemy. Former partisans, who knew the terrain well, helped identify camouflaged firing points and minefields. The contribution of the partisans to the success of Operation Kutuzov was highly appreciated by the Soviet command. More than 3,000 partisans received orders and medals, and 8 commanders of partisan formations were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The experience of cooperation between regular troops and partisan formations, gained during the Oriol offensive operation, was subsequently successfully applied in the liberation of other occupied territories of the Soviet Union. By the end of July 1943, Soviet troops had approached the outskirts of Oriol. The city, transformed by the Germans into a veritable fortress, was to be liberated in fierce battles. The Hitlerite command attached great importance to holding this vital communications hub, understanding that the loss of Oriol would mean the collapse of the entire defensive system on the central sector of the Eastern Front. To defend the city's outskirts, the Germans created a powerful system of fortifications. Every stone house was turned into a strongpoint with embrasures, machine gun nests, and minefields. Anti-tank guns were installed at street intersections, covering all approaches to the city. Building basements were connected by underground passages, allowing defenders to maneuver forces while remaining impervious to artillery fire. Particularly strong fortifications were created in the southeastern part of the city, where industrial enterprises with their massive reinforced concrete structures were located. The Soviet command meticulously prepared for the assault on the city's outskirts. Special assault groups were formed, each including a rifle platoon reinforced with sappers, flamethrower operators, and anti-tank rifle crews. Such groups possessed high mobility and firepower, necessary for urban combat. The tactics of the assault groups were refined down to the smallest detail. Some soldiers provided covering fire. Others made passages through obstacles, and still others burst into buildings and destroyed the enemy in close combat. Snipers played a special role, targeting German machine gunners and officers. The offensive on the outskirts of Oriol began at dawn on August 3rd. After a short but powerful artillery barrage, the assault groups moved forward. The first to engage were units of Colonel Panchuk's 129th Rifle Division. his soldiers attacked German positions in the area of the Oryol-Tovarny railway station. Fierce battles ensued for every building, for every meter of city territory. The Germans resisted desperately, understanding that there was nowhere left to retreat. Particularly stubborn battles unfolded for the station building, which the enemy had turned into a real bastion. Lieutenant Mikhailov's assault group managed to break through to the building from the rear, using drainage ditches. The soldiers threw grenades into the basement, where the German garrison was located, and then burst inside. In hand-to-hand combat, Soviet soldiers destroyed over 30 Hitlerites and captured 4 machine guns. The capture of the station opened the way to the central districts of the city. On the northern outskirts of Oryol, units of the 308th Rifle Division advanced. Here, the Germans had created a particularly strong defense node in the area of the brick factory. The massive walls of the production buildings, reinforced with sandbags, seemed impregnable. Division Commander Colonel Gurtiev made an unconventional decision. Instead of a frontal assault, he sent 1 battalion to bypass the factory to cut off the enemy's retreat routes, and concentrated the main forces for the assault. Artillerymen rolled out guns for direct fire and opened fire on embrasures and windows. Under the cover of this fire, the assault groups approached the factory walls. Sappers laid explosives and breached the walls, through which infantry burst inside. A fierce battle ensued in the labyrinth of factory premises. The Germans, retreating, blew up ceilings behind them. But this did not stop the Soviet soldiers. By noon, the factory was completely cleared of the enemy. In this battle, Colonel Gurtiev was mortally wounded, shielding the regimental commander from German grenade shrapnel. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. On the western outskirts of the city, tank units operated successfully. T-34 tanks, operating in small groups of 3 to 4 vehicles, supported the infantry with fire and tracks. Lieutenant Dmitriev's crew, having broken through into the rear of the German defense, destroyed an artillery battery and sowed panic among the enemy. This allowed rifle units to quickly advance and consolidate on an important line. By the end of August 3rd, Soviet troops had consolidated their positions on the outskirts of Oryol, creating the prerequisites for a decisive assault on the city. The German command, realizing the inevitability of defeat, began preparations for the evacuation of its main forces, while simultaneously mining important urban facilities. Ahead were decisive battles for the complete liberation of the first regional center recaptured from the enemy during the summer offensive of 1943. August 5th, 1943, became the day of Oryol's final liberation. During the night, Soviet troops launched a decisive assault on the city's central districts. Fierce street battles continued until dawn. The Germans had turned every stone building into a strong point, every intersection into a defensive node. The enemy offered particularly stubborn resistance in the area of the city prison and the former NKVD building, where multi-tiered firing positions had been set up. Soldiers of the 308th Rifle Division, advancing from the north, employed well-practiced tactics. Assault groups infiltrated through courtyards and breaches in walls, bypassing fortified buildings from the flanks. Sappers cleared passages through mined areas, and then infantrymen stormed into buildings and cleared them of the enemy. Flamethrower operators burned out particularly stubborn pockets of resistance. During the assault on the city administration building, Lieutenant Sokolov's platoon distinguished itself. His soldiers, using a smokescreen, managed to approach the building and bombard the firing positions on the first floor with grenades. Then they burst inside and in fierce hand-to-hand combat destroyed the enemy garrison, capturing important documents of the German command. In retreat, the Hitlerites sought to destroy the city's infrastructure. Special demolition teams mined bridges, power stations, the water supply, and large buildings. Delayed action mines were laid in the city center. However, Soviet sappers, acting with exceptional courage, managed to defuse most of the charges. Lieutenant Drozhin's platoon particularly distinguished itself, neutralizing over 40 mines and demolition charges in a single night. Despite all efforts, the Germans managed to blow up the railway bridge across the Oka and disable the city's power station. Some administrative buildings and food warehouses were set on fire, but the main objects of the city's infrastructure were saved thanks to the selfless actions of Soviet soldiers. By noon on August 5th, enemy resistance in the city was finally broken. The last groups of German soldiers attempting to break out of the encirclement were destroyed or captured. The red banner was hoisted over the city theater building, a symbol of the liberation of the first regional center during the Red Army's summer offensive. News of Orel's liberation instantly spread throughout the country. On the same day, Belgorod was also liberated. On the evening of August 5th, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's order for the first artillery salute of the war in honor of the troops who liberated Orel and Belgorod was broadcast on the radio. At 2400 hours, the sky over Moscow was lit up by the flashes of 12 volleys from 120 guns. This historic salute marked the beginning of the tradition of celebrating major Red Army victories with ceremonial artillery volleys. From this moment, Orel and Belgorod became known as cities of the first salute. The liberation of Orel had immense moral and psychological significance. For the first time, a regional center, which had been under German occupation for almost 2 years, was liberated. This clearly demonstrated to the whole world the increased power of the Red Army and the inevitability of the final defeat of Hitlerite Germany. For the residents of Orel, this day became a true celebration. Despite the destruction and fires, people went out into the streets, greeting their liberators with flowers and tears of joy. Many citizens immediately joined in the work of restoring the urban economy and assisting wounded soldiers. Operation Kutuzov became a turning point in the Battle of Kursk. By August 5, 1943, Soviet troops had completely liberated Oryol and eliminated the strategically important Oryol salient. The results of this operation exceeded the initial expectations of the Soviet command. Over 24 days of the offensive, the troops of the Bryansk, Western, and Central fronts advanced up to 150 kilometers, liberated more than 4,000 settlements, and defeated 15 enemy divisions. German losses amounted to about 80,000 soldiers and officers killed and wounded, over 200 tanks and assault guns, and more than 600 aircraft. Soviet troops managed to capture significant trophies: hundreds of artillery pieces, thousands of machine guns and submachine guns, and warehouses with ammunition and equipment. The losses of the Red Army were also substantial: about 112,000 people killed, wounded, and missing in action, and more than 300 tanks and self-propelled guns. However, these sacrifices were not in vain. The strategic goal of the operation was fully achieved. The elimination of the Oryol salient had immense strategic significance. The threat of a flanking attack on Moscow was removed. The front line was significantly shortened, which allowed forces to be freed up for offensives in other directions. The German command lost an important bridgehead from which it planned to resume the offensive on the Soviet capital. Operation Kutuzov, in conjunction with the successful Operation Rumyantsev in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction, marked the final transfer of strategic initiative to the Red Army. After these defeats, the Wehrmacht could no longer conduct large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The liberation of Oryol, the first regional center during the summer offensive, had immense moral significance. For the first time during the war, a solemn artillery salute thundered in Moscow. This event caused a powerful patriotic surge among Soviet citizens and instilled confidence in an early victory. The international significance of Operation Kutuzov is also difficult to overestimate. The successful Soviet offensive made a strong impression on the Allies and neutral countries, demonstrating the increased power of the Red Army. Hitler's propaganda could no longer conceal the seriousness of the situation on the Eastern Front. Turkey finally abandoned plans to enter the war on the side of Germany, and Sweden limited the export of strategic raw materials to the Third Reich. Operation Kutuzov became a vivid example of the increased military art of Soviet commanders. The skillful combination of a frontal offensive with flanking attacks, effective interaction of various branches of service, and the correct use of tank formations. All this testified to a qualitatively new level of planning and conducting offensive operations. The experience gained during Operation Kutuzov was successfully applied in subsequent offensive operations of the Red Army. Particularly valuable were the developments in breaking through deeply echeloned enemy defenses, conducting urban combat, and interacting with partisan formations. The liberation of Oryol was not just a military victory. It symbolized the beginning of a new stage of the war, when the initiative finally passed to the Red Army, and German troops were forced to switch to strategic defense along the entire Eastern Front. Operation Kutuzov went down in history not only as a brilliant military success, but also as a unique laboratory of combat experience, which gave the Red Army invaluable lessons in conducting modern warfare. Soviet military leaders applied a number of innovative tactical techniques, which subsequently became classics of military art. First of all, this was the echeloned use of artillery during the breakthrough of fortified defenses. The double artillery barrage, when shells were successively transferred from one line to another, ensuring constant fire cover for the advancing infantry, became standard practice in subsequent operations. No less important was the experience of the massive use of tank formations. Instead of distributing tanks among infantry units, the Soviet command created powerful armored fists capable of developing tactical success into an operational breakthrough. It was during Operation Kutuzov that the tactics of introducing tank corps into the breakthrough, after the successful breakthrough of the defenses by rifle formations, were worked out. Of particular note is the organization of interaction between various branches of the armed forces. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation acted as a single, well-coordinated mechanism. Commanders of all levels learned to coordinate the efforts of disparate units to achieve a common goal. This interaction became the hallmark of Soviet military art in the final stage of the war. A unique achievement of Operation Kutuzov was the effective interaction of regular troops with partisan formations. Partisans not only provided intelligence and disorganized the enemy's rear, but also directly participated in hostilities, capturing and holding important objects until the main forces arrived. This experience was successfully applied during the liberation of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. The liberation of Oryol had immense symbolic significance. For the first time in years of war, a major regional center, which had been under German occupation for almost 2 years, was liberated. This event clearly demonstrated to the whole world that the strategic initiative had finally passed to the Red Army. It was in honor of the liberation of Oryol and Belgorod that the first ceremonial artillery salute of the war thundered in Moscow. From then on, salutes became a traditional way to celebrate major victories of Soviet troops, and Oryol and Belgorod forever went down in history as cities of the first salute. The memory of the liberation of Oryol and the heroes of Operation Kutuzov is carefully preserved in popular memory. Numerous monuments and memorial plaques have been erected in the city. Streets have been named after commanders and ordinary soldiers who distinguished themselves during the assault on the city. Annually, on August 5th, Oryol celebrates City Day, coinciding with the Day of Liberation. On this day, solemn events, military parades, and reconstructions of historical events are held. Operation Kutuzov occupies a special place in the history of the Great Patriotic War. It marked the transition from defensive actions to a strategic offensive along the entire front. After the Battle of Kursk and the liberation of Oryol, German troops could no longer conduct large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The long and difficult but steady path to victory began.